of a global minimum transparency standard for chemicals of concern in materials and products, an essential tool for achieving sustainable resource management and the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Mafoko Pumani. I am an environmental health campaigner from Groundwork in South Africa. Today's other speakers are Dr. Olga Sparinskaya and Alexandra Katabo, both co-directors of Health and Environment Justice Support, Dr. Andreas Privotnik, Senior Policy Advisor, Chemical Pollutants and Chemicals, the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, Dr. Eva Lainela, Principal Administrator of Hazard Assessment Program and Risk Reduction Program, Oecd, Michael Stanley Jones, Program Management Officer, Ecosystems Integration Branch at UNEP, and lastly, Yuyun Ismawati, founder of Nexus 3 Foundation. Olga, are you sharing our presentation?
I think Alex
rather.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you time to share your screen, Alex. Thank you. And just before presenting what the elements of a global minimum transparency standard could contain and how it could be constructed, we first want to put chemicals into the larger systemic picture of production, consumption, and sustainable development. This really is a contextualization aimed to help you understand why we need the standard. The world is currently facing a triple and interlinked crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And chemicals are directly or indirectly involved in all of them. So in order to fully address the principal drivers underlying these crises, we must first take control over the use and dissemination of chemicals in value chains for materials and products. Chemicals have key functions in production and extraction of natural resources and in turning raw materials into higher value products for the markets. They're used as process chemicals in agriculture, mining, in the extraction of petroleum and natural gas, as well as by refining and manufacturing industries. And at the same time, most of our basic process chemicals are based on fossil feedstock and minerals, and consequently also a driver for these industries. The chemical industry is the world's largest energy consumer, accounting for approximately 30% of the total energy demand in industry, or 10% of the total global energy demand. And we are already overshooting the annual sustainable outtake of resources, and annual waste generation is projected to increase 70% by 2050. Global consumption of materials is expected to double over the next 4 decades, which will require more energy, water, and mineral resources. The manufacturing industry is also the 3rd largest carbon dioxide emitter, thus a principal driver of climate change. Value chains for materials and products are often multinational and consequently covered by multiple national legislations and jurisdictions. This can definitely make compliance checks for restricted chemicals in one jurisdiction a rather daunting task. Now I would like to give the floor to Olga Sparinskaya, Director of Health and Environment Justice Support, who will talk a little bit more about solutions to these systemic challenges. Olga, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mafoko. No, back please, the previous slides. Yes, now on the next slides, please. Yeah, here on this slide, you see a brief list of necessary changes to address the systemic challenges that Mafoko described. And first of all, it is important to ensure that chemicals are safe by design, which means they should easily degrade, should not be toxic, should not bioaccumulate and magnify in food chains. And it is also important to improve material resource efficiency, which means to ensure remanufacturing, repair, maintenance, recycling, and safe design of materials and products to reduce overall consumption. And improving material resource efficiency will help develop a circular economy, which is an economic model that will contribute to prolonged product life and help reduce the need for virgin raw materials that will eventually result in less ecosystem destruction, less negative climate impact, and pollution. However, while talking about circular economy, it is important to ensure that this economic model does not lead to recirculation of toxic chemicals in new products and in the contamination of the supply chain. So to avoid this, it is crucial to know what chemicals are in materials and products, and this is where a global harmonization of transparency standards for hazardous chemicals in products and materials should be adopted. And next slide, please. So, for example, mercury is in many types of products, including batteries and switches and relays and lamps and other electronic products and non-electronic measuring devices. And in addition, mercury may be used in cosmetics and pesticides and paints and even vaccines. And it may still be identified in many commercial products, such as toys and construction materials and plastic. So while mercury in cosmetics and pesticides is subject to the global harmonized system for labeling chemicals, could be disclosed within and outside the supply chain via an ingredient list. For manufactured products or articles, the transparency requirements for information about mercury do not exist. And some products listed in Annex A to the Minamata Convention have their commodity codes specifically for customs purposes. However, they are not well harmonized between countries and not for all products in Annex A. And next slide, please. So why is it important to achieve transparency of information on chemicals in products? So first of all, information disclosure of hazardous chemicals in products will help identify products with hazardous chemicals and determine product components that contain such chemicals. For mercury-containing products, this is very important because some products, for example, those listed in Annex A to the Minamata Convention, like batteries and electrical switches, may be part of more complex products from electrical and electronic appliances to toys. And disclosure of information will also support safe substitution with non-toxic or less toxic alternatives and informed decisions for non-toxic sustainable product design. And in addition, such information will support informed decisions for reuse and recycling of waste into toxic-free secondary raw material. Yeah, next slide, please. So there are a variety of initiatives that help to understand whether products contain toxic chemicals. Here on this slide, some initiatives are presented, and the first one here is the Intergovernmental System represented by UNEP Chemicals and Products Program. And this program was adopted by the stakeholders of the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management in 2015. And it is a voluntary disclosure program that has the long-term aspirational goal for full information disclosure for all intentionally added chemicals in products within and outside supply chains. And the products covered are only manufactured products or articles, not cleaning or personal hygienic products or cosmetics. So information disclosure here implies that there is transparency about the identity, presence, and ideally concentration of chemicals with hazard properties in products. So another example of transparency in the value chain on this slide is the European Union regional database that was developed by the European Chemical Agency to provide greater transparency of information to manufacturers, consumers, and recyclers. And according to the requirements, all substances of very high concern from the EU candidate list in concentration of at least 0.1% by weight of all constituent components of products including waste and waste materials traded to be reused or recycled, must be reported to the European Union Chemical Agency and will be included in the database. And this transparency requirements targets all manufacturers in the EU as well as importers of materials and products to be placed on the EU market. So some other examples presented on this slide show different initiatives from governments and companies to establish information systems that help consumers and businesses and retailers find safer products that contain ingredients that are non-toxic or less toxic to human health and the environment. And as you see, companies set the level of disclosure they want to establish. And this involves deciding how they will meet relevant regulatory requirements and stakeholder demands and how they will verify the information disclosure. And next slide, please. So the described initiatives have certain challenges. And for example, there are no clear motivation for companies to join the voluntary UNEP Chemicals and Products program. And industry is reluctant to share information on the chemical composition of materials and products outside supply chains. So the European Union database is only regional to the European Union and does not impose same disclosure requirements to products traded outside the region. And also voluntary transparency schemes from industry are usually limited to transparency for the narrow within supply chain stakeholders, which is an obstacle to sound lifecycle management of materials and products. And also voluntary transparency schemes by industry result in multiple parallel standards, and the information on the chemical composition of materials stays with the certifier. And moreover, complying with these multiple standards can be a challenge for small and medium-sized companies if they are part of the supply chains. And to add to this, non-harmonized rules of information exchange on chemicals in products contribute to challenges from internet trade, and internet trade is growing and largely uncontrolled, and customer cannot hold the company that runs the internet platform responsible for harm from a product that is sold by a third party on the platform. And next slide, please. So mercury in some products is regulated globally under the Minamata Convention and regionally, for example, under the European Union Directive on the restriction on the use of certain hazardous substances in electrical and electronic equipment, and the EU Toy Directive and the EU Cosmetic Regulations and so on. However, in these regulations, except the cosmetic regulation, there are only regulatory limits and no information disclosure requirements. And this means that the only way to ensure compliance with the law are spot checks, which should be done by national authorities or by companies. And if there was a mandatory information disclosure, lots of resources and time could be saved from spot checks. And next slide, please. So summing up, I may say that challenges associated with non-harmonized rules of information exchange on chemicals in products include costly systems of, for compliance checks that I mentioned, and developing countries usually do not have nor technical nor financial capacity for a proper check of potential hazardous content of imported products. And also costly control systems are imposed on the supply chains as they have to comply with the requirements not only from different jurisdictions, but also from different sectors. And trade between countries is complicated and often results in double standards and dumping of lesser quality products in countries with less ambitious chemical legislation. And also jurisdictions, mainly developing countries, countries in transition, lack regulations on many chemicals of concern, meaning there are no reporting thresholds or transparency requirements. And the markets in such countries are flooded with products containing toxic chemicals. And in addition, confidential business information is a huge obstacle on the way towards transparency, and the industry is unwilling to share information on the chemical composition of materials. and often hides information under such claims as non-toxic or contains no harsh chemicals, nor carcinogenic chemicals. And in short, I would like to say that having a globally harmonized minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products has clear advantages. And I want to highlight the word minimum here, as it defines a minimum level to disclose, a minimum level of information disclosure. And of course, we encourage companies to disclose more information on chemicals as they need and as it is relevant for their businesses. And what is important is that a global minimum transparency standard puts in place conditions for disclosing information about toxic chemicals inside and outside supply chains for materials and products. And it helps eliminate double standards and at the same time address the challenges with internet trade by putting in place conditions for harmonized accounting for hazardous chemicals in products. And now I would like to give the floor to Andreas Privodnik from SSNC, Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, to share our vision of construction and elements of a global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products that we are discussing today. So Andreas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olga. So which chemicals should we include in the transparency standard? We suggest to start with already regulated or widely recognized chemicals of concern. And this includes chemicals from global treaties, regional legislation, or chemicals that are internationally recognized on lists as particularly hazardous. Justifiably, we can collectively call them chemicals of global concern, and consequently, no confidential business information claims are justifiable. We believe that this may be a realistic approach to begin with, so that negotiations for putting the standard in place do not become unnecessarily lengthy or complicated. Next slide, please. Alexandra, next slide, please. Thank you. So this infographic shows the elements that we suggest to include. So in addition to mercury and mercury compounds, banned and restricted by the Minamata Convention. Can you please go back one slide, Alex? So in addition to the mercury and mercury compounds regulated by the Minamata Convention, we suggest to include chemicals banned and restricted by the Stockholm and Basel Conventions, the Montreal Protocol of the Vienna Convention, carcinogenic and suspected carcinogenic compounds listed by the WHO International Agency for Research on Cancer, the EU ROS chemicals that also covers mercury, and finally also the EU substances of very high concern, and the latter contains 223 compounds on the candidate list at present. Chemicals from all suggested elements share one or several of the hazard properties prioritized for information disclosure, according to the Unit Chemicals in Products program. Furthermore, with very few exemptions, no formal transparency requirements are in place for the listed treaties. So in this respect, our suggested GMTS approach would address a gap. With transparency in place, all stakeholders along the life cycle of the products can keep track of the presence of hazardous chemicals in the materials. And this can promote correct handling of the materials and safe and resource efficient material cycles, just like Olga said. Next slide, please. Ideally, the standard should be binding from the very beginning. We can create a soft standard, that is to say a standard that only requires disclosure of the identity of the chemicals, or we can create a hard standard in which the disclosed chemicals are also banned or restricted. And of course, the first approach does not exclude the second approach. We can start with a soft standard and then gradually move on to a hard standard. Next slide, please. Can you change the slide? Thank you. So to initiate, no, can we go back one slide, please? Can you back one slide? Okay, thank you. So to initiate the process towards development of a binding standard, we probably need a decision from the United Nations Environment Assembly. And for this to happen, we need a country or a group of progressive countries to propose resolutions. And of course, we hope that this can take place already in connection with the next UNEA meeting, UNEA 6. It should be investigated if the standard can be hosted in an existing treaty to make the best use of existing administrative and financial arrangements for an existing secretariat. But if this is not a viable option, we need to consider to create a new treaty. Yet another option would be to create a standard like the globally harmonized standard for chemical hazard communication, the GHS, which is voluntary, but once adopted into national legislation becomes binding. However, we believe that this is not the preferred option because drawing upon experience from implementation of the GHS, we can see that it is quite heterogeneous, also partly because countries have adopted different versions of the standard. So we prefer the binding option from the very beginning, if it's possible. Next slide, please. In parallel, though, we suggest to work also for inclusion of text about the standard into the targets, indicators, and milestones that are currently under development for the upgraded version of the UN Chemical Strategy SAICM. And how this could look in practice, you can see in the annexes to our white paper that you can download from www.globaltransparency.org or from the outcome document from the discussions in Virtual Working Group 1 in the post-2020 process for SAICM. If included into the successor to SAICM, it would send an important signal for the need for a globally harmonized transparency standard. And at the same time, it would be an important instrument to support national implementation plans for the issue of concerned chemicals in products. And for this to happen, we need a decision from the stakeholders at the ICCM5 meeting in the post-2020 process for SAICM later this year. Theoretically, the standard could be developed entirely under the successor to SAICM, for example, as part of a revigorated Unit Chemicals in Products program. However, as Olga already said, experience shows that very few companies voluntarily join the Unit Chemicals in Products program. So this is probably not the preferred option. It should not be the first option in any way. So we suggest to opt for a binding standard, but in parallel also work for inclusion of text linked to the targets, indicators, and milestones in the upgraded SAICM. And with this, I hand over to Alex to take you through the last section of our part of the presentation. Alex, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Andreas. I'm having a bit of a problem with hearing because I hear every voice like 3 times with a delay. So I hope you can hear me and it's gonna be fine. So for both the binding and the voluntary approach, we would need a multi-stakeholder committee, which is free from the influence of commercial interests, coordinated by the inter-organization program for the IOMC. It should be tasked with the development of a transparency standard. The format of this standard should be should provide most stringent disclosure thresholds. It should be cross-sectoral, and it should have a living nature, updated when the underlying conventions, regional legislations, and lists are updated. It should have an option to develop complementary criteria for chemicals of global concern using a chemical group approach to respect the precautionary principle and speed up the listing of hazardous chemicals. The data administration and distribution should either provide centralized administration in a secretariat for the multilateral instrument hosting the standard, similar to the arrangement for the SIP database at the ECHA, which is the EU Chemicals Agency. We suggest that the information is distributed to the stakeholders that need it in the form of an electronic system. For instance, like the idea for an electronic product passport, which is now under development in the EU. It should be a simple electronic system that can be accessed, for instance, by a cell phone, so that it works in every country. So how to support the GMTS idea? Parties of global MEAs and other stakeholders should, in our opinion, recognize the link between the life cycle management of materials and products with the sound management of chemicals inherent to materials. They should also send a clear and strong signal to UNEP for the importance of the GMTS idea as a key tool for the transformation of the economy. It should propose, a stakeholder should propose resolutions to UNEA 6 with a call for the development of a binding GMTS, and scientific bodies of the MEAs, progressive and responsible companies and industry associations should repeatedly highlight the benefits of the GMTS idea for addressing all the challenges that we have to address. So we thank you very much. Here you find additional information at our website, globalchemicaltransparency.org. Please reach out to us. And now I hand over to Mafoko. Thank you, Mafoko.
Thank you very much, Alex. I would like to now hand over to Dr. Eva Lainela, Principal Administrator of Hazard Assessment Program and Risk Reduction Program from the Oecd. Eva, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And yes, I'm also here on behalf of Bob Diedrich to provide some reflections for you from IGO involved in chemicals management on this idea of the global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals and products. And certainly this is the need for more information in products comes up in many discussions regarding chemicals management, from the assessment stage to management during the use of products and end of life. If you could go to the next slide, please. So regarding information on chemicals, we've certainly come a long way over the last several years. So more and more hazard and exposure information is being shared along with the detailed property information of chemicals. And the OECD has helped to facilitate that by developing the eChem portal system, which enables countries to share information on the hazard, exposure, and properties of chemicals, as well as classifications. Also, more and more countries are setting up pollutant release and transfer registries, which provide information to stakeholders about releases of chemicals from installations. And also with the development of the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling and its implementation in countries, we have more and more information on the presence of hazardous substances and mixtures. Next slide, please. However, as mentioned, information on chemicals in the articles is one area that is very much lacking, and we can sort of look at this as the next frontier of information sharing. This will also help support the concept of a circular economy. We want to know, as we move towards more circular approaches for materials management, that the materials that are being recycled or cycled back into the economy from articles we want to know their chemical composition, so those can be properly managed. Also, there is a need for this information for consumer and worker protection. For example, firefighters, when they go into fire situations, it'd be helpful for them to know the combustion products of different articles that might be found in homes or installations to help them also risk manage their chemical exposures. The next slide, please. So a few thoughts on where we are with technical feasibility. If you can click to the next. So you heard also already about the SCIP database that's now in place in the EU. And actually, the impetus for this database also really came from the Waste Directive and the need for recyclers and end-of-life managers to have more information on chemicals and articles and products. And so this is already one type of technical approach that has been put into place to share information and track hazardous chemicals and articles. Next, click, if you can click again. Yes, thank you. Also in Japan, there's been a system developed that already provides a standard for collection and dissemination of information on chemicals and products. And this is through the Chem Sherpa system, where upstream companies can provide information to downstream users and companies through a standard that has been developed for their use. Next slide, please. Or next, yes. Also within the automotive industry, there are examples of a system that's now been in place for many, many years in terms of sharing information on substances within the supply chain of automotive manufacturing. And this includes reference lists for declarable substances. And one of the reasons for creating this system was also to provide regulatory agility for automotive companies. So if new declarable substances became online or there were new regulations, they had an immediate idea of the substances within their supply chains. You can click once more, please. Also, now coming online are more and more companies offering services, so consulting companies offering services for blockchain systems and networks that chemical companies could leverage to share information along their supply chains. And this can be an option to share information if there is not a system where there's a trusted third party set up to facilitate this type of sharing. So a number of the technical pieces to be able to share this type of information have already been demonstrated to be in place. If you can go to the next slide, please. Of course, there do remain a number of hurdles for moving towards a global transparency standard. And as mentioned by one of the previous speakers, this can include confidentiality claims, especially if the idea is to track more and more types of chemicals, as industry has also made a lot of innovation investments in particular chemicals and want to protect those investments. And so we need mechanisms to deal with various types of claims of confidentiality and protected information, while also sharing information more transparently. Also, some sectors are very heterogeneous in their nature and the types of chemicals that are used. In the automotive chain, as mentioned, the types of chemicals used along the supply chains are quite homogeneous, but in others there's quite a mix, and so this provides another challenge to tracking and establishing the types of information in products. Of course, we also deal with worldwide and international complex and dynamic supply chains. The types of chemicals that we use to make different materials are not always consistent and change dynamically within supply chains, and this is another then sort of ongoing challenge that we need to be aware of in setting up a transparency standard. Typically to date, there hasn't been a lot of pressure on supply chains to release more information on chemicals that are used in articles. Sometimes if there are large downstream users or retailers that do have a significant share of the market, they can apply more pressure on their supply chains, but it's harder for smaller downstream users to do so. Also, we have, in many cases, highly complex articles, such as in electronics. We also have some simple articles. So these are different variations that will need to be dealt with in any such standard. Finally, if such standard is to be mandatory, this would probably require legislative reforms in countries that would then need to be put in place in order to implement any type of mandatory system. The next slide, please. So just a couple of thoughts about possible roles of intergovernmental organizations if global transparency standard is put into place. So IGOs could have a role in the development and maintenance of an electronic data transfer standard that's then implemented within countries or companies or along supply chains. Another possibility is for IGOs to also play a role in developing or maintaining a list of substances that are covered by any such standard. And finally, there could be a possible role for IGOs as the third party for data dissemination. Data could be collected and stored in countries and then provided to IGOs for dissemination. Or going further, IGOs could also be involved in collection, storage, and dissemination of the information as a sort of broader role. So these are just some reflections from the OECD on the ideas of this concept and where some of the challenges are, but where we have already made some progress to being able to implement such a standard. So I thank you for your time, and I'll pass it back to Mofoko. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for highlighting the important role that IGOs can play in GMTS. Speaking next will be Michael Stanley Jones, Program Management Officer, Ecosystems Integration Branch from UNEP. Michael, floor is yours. Thank you. Michael, you're muted. There you are. Unmute yourself, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for the invitation and to the speakers for very informative presentations. I wanted to start with a bit of the prehistory of public right to know. And my presentation is to provide examples that build the case for a global minimum transparency standard. So if we go back to December 4th, 1984, the Union Carbide chemical plant accident in Bhopal, India, really opened the new era in public right to know. That was when an extremely toxic methyl isocyanate gas escaped and thousands of people died overnight from what was then considered the worst industrial disaster in history. That led to a number of actions by governments. I am from California and was active in research on California's Proposition 65. And so that's where the regulatory story begins. That is the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986, which was adopted by the people of California through a referendum. So this was not initiated in the legislature, but was initiated by a public vote to create this law, the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act, better known as Prop 65. And what this act requires is that the state of California maintain a list of chemicals that cause cancer or birth defects or other reproductive harm, and that these chemicals in products be identified using warning labels that appear in public spaces where these chemicals, or these products rather, are sold. So they include additives or ingredients in pesticides, some common household products, foods, drugs, dyes, or solvents. And they also include those that are used in manufacturing or construction, or maybe byproducts of chemical processes, such as motor vehicle exhaust. So you can see, if you can go back to the first title page, you can see an example of this Prop 65 warning label. This is really the earliest attempt to provide the public directly with information about chemical hazards. Now, third slide, please, on public perceptions. There were other actions taken in 1986. California developed, excuse me, the United States developed the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA, of 1986. Section of that act, I think it's 313, created the Toxic Release Inventory, which now is a North American instrument. There's toxic release inventories in Canada and Mexico, and these provided models for the development of the Kiev Protocol on pollutant release and transfer registers, which were adopted in Kiev Protocol in 2003. The protocol was a protocol to the Aarhus Convention, which was adopted in 1998, which is the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters, short name Aarhus Convention, hosted by the Economic Commission for Europe. So this Kiev Protocol on PRTR, inspired by the EPCRA Act of 1986 and the establishment of the Toxic Release Inventory, became then the framework in which the European Pollutant Release and Transfer Registry was created as a fulfillment by EU countries of their obligations under the Kiev Protocol. OECD's pointed out that, in fact, there is global work to harmonize PRTR systems. Mentioning the Toxic Release Inventory is quite different from the European PRTR, and there is, again, a different system in place in Japan. But this dialogue has been hosted by OECD on the harmonization of pollutant release and transfer registers since the adoption, very shortly after the adoption of the Kiev Protocol. I used to serve in the task force on PRTR at OECD. Back to the EU context, in 2016, the Barometer survey on chemical safety was carried out and involved interviews with more than 27,000, nearly 28,000 citizens from all EU member states. And there's some interesting conclusions about how the public viewed chemical safety and information access back in 2016. Two out of three residents who were interviewed, when asked whether a product contains particularly hazardous chemicals, they thought that the seller was already required by law to provide them with this information. So the expectation was perhaps higher than the reality. Almost half of respondents thought that chemical products were safe for human health and the environment. But against that, more recent survey conducted suggests that 90% of Europeans are worried about the impacts of chemicals on the environment, and 84% of Europeans are worried about the impact of chemicals presented in everyday products, that those products could be harmful to their health. So although there was a high expectation that information was already required to be provided by the sellers of products with chemicals of concern, nevertheless, there's still a very high level, evidence of a high level of public concern about the health impacts of these chemicals. REACH, the Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals Act, which was developed in the last decade, was criticized in this survey, particularly by NGOs who thought that it could deliver a higher level of protection for human health and environment, but its potential had not been fully developed yet. And so that's a very powerful piece of legislation requiring certain classes of chemicals to be evaluated for their safety, but not fully, the public at least was not fully confident that its potential had been reached. In particular, they pointed to the poor quality of registration dossiers and insufficient information on safe use of chemicals flowing through the supply chain and to consumers. Next slide, please. We heard reference already to the UNEP Chemicals in Products program. That was a program launched through SciCam, the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, as an emerging policy issue back in 2015. That program got off to a strong start. Developed the, next slide please, HazMix, the UNEP Chemicals and Products program developed the registry. Chemreg.net was the site for the HazMix repository. And that was a voluntary system, as you heard. And we heard criticisms that perhaps voluntary is not sufficiently robust to bring the information that's needed into the public realm. As of well, at its launch, I think there was 16,000 chemical regulations and 122 countries were covered. And that database grew to 26,000 global regulations by 133 countries. At the last check-in that I did, I had seen that the ChemReg website had not been updated since February of 2018. And the chemicals and products listed on those web pages, I hadn't seen any post 2017. So it seems that the voluntary system, which got off to a very strong start, has somewhat sputtered and is now no longer the place to go for that type of information. I hope that I am wrong and someone can update this information, but from the web, it doesn't seem that this is an up-to-date database. Next slide, please. In 2015, the EU Circular Economy Action Plan was adopted and developed as part of the EU Green Deal. There were 54 actions that were recommended that had been implemented by 2019, including the Sustainable Product Policy Framework. Next slide, please. I'll just highlight two of the chapters of that plan. On textiles, to make these products fit for climate neutral, resource efficient, and circular economy. There were specific recommendations. Among them, that priority should be given to addressing product groups identified in the context of the value chain, including textiles and including high impact intermediary products such as chemicals. I want to take a side look at chemicals in textiles. Chapter 4.2 looks at the progressive substitution of hazardous substances and harmonized systems to track and manage information on substances. Next slide. Chemicals in clothing are one theme that UNEP, my agency, has highlighted. It was also adopted as an emerging issue in 2015 by SciCam at the International Conference on Chemicals Management. And there, the issues concern not only inputs to the production of the commodities, such as cotton, that go into fabric, into clothing, but also the chemicals that are used in processing and dyeing, particularly those fabrics, which can include heavy metals, can include brominated flame retardants. There was mention made of working with firefighters who have an interest in knowing what kind of chemicals might be in the buildings and products that they're extinguishing fires of, and therefore exposing themselves to and of high risk. In California, before I joined the United Nations, I worked with California firefighters on brominated flame retardants. So this is a long-standing issue, but one that in clothing has been thematized, if not fully addressed. California has removed some BFRs, brominated flame retardants, from children's clothing because of the hazards they present. In 2019, the United Nations agencies, 9 of them, formed the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. And this question of chemicals in clothing, toxics in fabric, is one of the themes addressed by this UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. So I give a little sidebar on that. In 2020, UNEP published Sustainability and Circularity in the Textile Value Chain, a global stock-taking report. And again, the issue of chemicals in fabric was thematized. Next slide, please. Back to the back to the EU scene. The public consultation was held in 2018 on options to address the interface between chemicals, products, and waste. And issue 2 I'll highlight from this 2019 report was on substances of concern and recycled products. So we already heard that to make the economy circular, to be able to recover and reuse the stock of materials used in products, it's important to know what constituents they're made of, what chemicals are in them, and whether those chemicals are safe, and therefore reuse is recommended. Next slide, please. In 2020, the EU adopted the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, also featured in the EU Green Deal theme. A public consultation on REACH regulations and its revision is currently open through 15th of April, 2022, which is part of this implementation of the EU Chemical Strategy. So we see, finishing on that, 7 key actions of the strategy: banning the most harmful chemicals in consumer products, promoting resilience of supply and sustainability of critical chemicals, and playing a leading role globally by championing and promoting high standards. Now, this is among the actions recommended in the 2020 strategy, is really the remit to not just change regulations affecting EU countries, but really to try to influence the global scene on this. And you can see from the examples I've shared of the California legislation, of the US EPCRA 1986 legislation, and of the momentum in the EU, there has really been an effort internationally to move towards global standards. Next slide, please. I'm going to wrap here. I think we've already heard about the benefits of such a system. I want to conclude with some thoughts on pathways, the options of voluntary versus legally binding. I would just point out this is not an either or, but both are usually needed, and that is voluntary can build consensus towards legally binding results. We're now in the phase of developing a global instrument on plastic pollution. The groundwork was really laid through the regional seas conventions and their action plans on plastic pollution regionally. And that's sort of stepwise. You build up from the knowledge you have in countries, with regulations, with experience, with databases. You build up regionally with action plans, and at a certain point when things are ripe, the political will exists to take things to the global level. A last hint I wanted to give on how to build the momentum further towards a transparency standard, and that is the recently launched Digital Environmental Sustainability Action Plan of the UN Codes Group, which is hundreds of IT advocates, digitalization, digital economy advocates across UN agencies who have helped develop an action plan called Accelerating Action Towards a Sustainable Planet in the Digital Age. And this action plan specifically calls for using the knowledge we've built up through these different systems on chemicals to bring the information to a new plateau where it can be useful for decision makers and for the public. Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too quick or too discursive, but any questions you have on the history of right to know. I've been involved in this work for quite a long time, working with the Kiev Protocol, the Aarhus Convention, SciCam,
Thank you,
OECD.
Michael.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We are slightly running out of time. Our last speaker for today is Yuyun Ismawati, founder of Nexus 3 Foundation. Yuyun, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mafoko. And hello, everyone. Hi, Michael. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So, Olga, should I share my screen or? Yeah? Okay, I'll share it.
It will be better if you share your screen because of the technical.
Yes, I will.
Thanks.
Okay. Let me see. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. But I know the time is short, so I'm not going to add a long talk about the need to have the global minimum transparency standard, but rather I'd like to share briefly about the perspective from a country in Indonesia. The regulations on mercury management in Indonesia is started with the ratification. There's a law number 11 that verify or enforcing the ratifications of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And that law became the umbrella of law for the rest of relevant regulations related to mercury. So there is a presidential decree concerning the National Action Plan to reduce and eliminate mercury. And after that, it's followed by the Ministry of Environment decree that explain in details how the presidential decree should be implemented. And then followed by the ministerial decrees, like the Minister of Health decree on the eliminations and withdrawal of the medical devices containing mercury. And then included also the storage of hazardous waste, which inside also including mercury storage. And then lastly, there is a trade control about the trade of mercury as hazardous substances. So all of this umbrella policy or framework on mercury management provided the basis of regulations regarding standards or how a product should be handled or managed at the end of life. So for Indonesia, the target to reduce and eliminate mercury using the baseline in 2018 and targeted different year for manufacture sector. The target is to reduce 50% of products containing mercury, like lamps and batteries, by 50% by 2030. And then for energy sector, the emissions from coal-fired power plants, especially, targeted will be reduced by 33% by 2030. While for ASGM sector has been the major source of mercury emissions in Indonesia. And the government already set the standard to be eliminated 100%. The mercury use in ASGM hotspots have to be 100% eliminated by 2025, which is in 3 years' time. And lastly, the health sector addressed mainly the medical devices containing mercury, such as thermometers, manometer, and dental amalgam. And in this case, relevant to the global minimum transparency standard, although the information is available, how much mercury in that products, there is no consent or announcement or information provided by the suppliers or even by the dentist who's using dental amalgam before they applied to their patients that this product containing mercury that will harm your body and your health. I mean, give the consent and then the information about what will be the potential impact. So giving the information about what's in the product is one thing, but informing the users, the consumers about the potential risk and impact to their health is another thing that we need to highlight it if we want to have the minimum standard, because putting it only in text, in the packaging or in the information brochures is not enough until it's enforced and implemented on the ground. I just want to move back a little bit about the transparency of a supply chain of mercury, because we are talking about mercury here. In Indonesia, we have illegal cinnabar mining, and identify the source of mercury productions could be also identifying the cinnabar mining sites, and then the smelters, processing units, and also mainly illegal. And also the commercial platforms where they sell it in the social media or trade hubs or trade commerce platforms and so on. So identify all of this supply chain is important to find out how they reach the manufacturers. And then there are several regulations that prohibiting the importations and the trade and use, but there is no prohibitions to open up cinnabar mining. So this unavailable regulation, there's a loopholes in the Indonesian regulations, because the regulation only exists to prohibit the importations, but not prohibit or ban the cinnabar mining at all. And also the smelting process will not mention anywhere in the regulations, and also the sale or export of elemental mercury in products. So this will be interesting to see if the minimum standard of transparency also could include where it's sourced. You know, so it's like in the food packaging, sourced from Ghana or sourced from, you know, it's very clear where they're from. That will be also interesting to see it in the supply chain of mercury. And then once the product ready to sell into the market, there is we call it a Standard Nasional Indonesia, or SNI. The SNI mainly applied for new products. No SNIs available for products made from recycled materials. Thank you, Eva, for showing the pictures of the kitchen utensils, the black one. We already took some samples of that kind of products, and it has BPA, PBDEs, and BFR, which is because it's very black. And there is no SNI for that in Indonesia. So public doesn't know whether the kitchen utensils that they use containing chemicals that potentially leach to the food when they're cooking because it's heated up. So the voluntary standards that existed usually valid for only 4 to 5 years. And then after that, because it's voluntary, they have limited time. After that, if the market and then the relevant ministers agree to enforce stringent and stricter standards, then the standard will be reviewed and then become mandatory with enforced by a particular ministerial decree. So for the essential products, usually the standards will be available since the beginning of the product's launch or introduced to the market and nationwide. But for recycled products or products made or content recycled materials, it's not available at all. And labeling, also another issue that inform customers or users about what's in it. In Indonesia, there are 3 ways to label your products. You can do it self-declare, and you have to, the second one is certified by a government agency or institution. And then the third one is done by the third party. Of course, the consumers prefer to have the third-party certifications or declaration or labeling because it's more trusted. But self-declare also sometimes, if the company is good enough and honest enough, they will show no harmful chemicals in it. But in some cases, in many cases that we seen in some of the sampling that we conducted, self-declares never show good results. So this is my last slide. So the challenges and opportunities for manufacturers in Indonesia are mainly the lack of laboratory to test toxic chemicals, especially POPs chemicals like PBDs, dioxins, BFR, UV 328. There is no laboratory available. So it will be tricky to push for a standard where the countries have no capacity at all to analyze the content of the chemicals in that product. And especially from recycled materials. I said this over and over again because it's in the circular economy discourses. And also the capacity for certification by the third party. This is also very limited in developing countries and in Indonesia too. And the verifications of self-declare of labeling need to be vigorously checked regularly by the relevant minister. But there is an opportunity for manufacturers that apply the global minimum transparency standard, that they will have the opportunity to sell their products or export it to the global market. I think these kind of incentives have to be highlighted to make an attractive invitations for manufacturers, especially. So when they have this the same standards, they can also sell and expand their market globally. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for all the inspiring speakers from the previous speakers. Welcome for question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. And we are very sorry for the and grateful for the Secretariat for giving us like extra minutes for this very important webinar. So thank you so much. And thank you very much for our guest speakers and Eva and Michael and you so for your very inspiring presentations and for your obvious support to the idea of the global minimum transparency standard. So we really appreciate your support, and we hope that this dialogue will continue and we will discuss it further at like different possible locations and events. So please keep up with us and please look through our website on the global minimum transparency standards and come in touch, and we will be happy to work with you further, all of you. And thank you for the questions and for the chats. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.